Hello, class. So this is week number 5. This is going to be our lesson on anxiety disorders. Take a look at this comic right here. This is some of the common experiences of anxiety, worrying about things, the preoccupation with a variety of different factors. The instructors thought this was pretty funny, so I carried this forward from prior semesters. Move forward and get right into our lecture. I have a little bit of review here for you. Let's get started by looking at that question we had in the prior lecture where we had someone who had bipolar 1 because they had experienced like 3 manic episodes. But this individual at that time hadn't experienced any depressive episodes. Now, this individual who's had 3 manic episodes, never had any depressive episodes, now they have 1 depressive episode. Before, remember, no depressive episodes, they had 3 manic episodes. Now they've had 1 depressive episode. The options are bipolar 1, bipolar 2 plus major depressive disorder, cyclothymic disorder, double depression. Take some time, think about your answer. I'm gonna drink some coffee, and then when I come back, we'll have the answer. That's right. It is bipolar 1. Remember, once you've had manic episodes, you will always have bipolar 1. So you don't need depressive episodes for bipolar 1, but once you have a depressive episode, you still have bipolar 1. So remember, bipolar 2, that's hypomania. That's hypomania and depressive episodes. So for bipolar 2, you need hypomania and depressive episodes. Bipolar 1, you just need mania. You add in a hypomanic episode, you still have bipolar 1 because you have a manic episode. You add in a depressive episode, you still have bipolar 1 because you have a manic episode. Bipolar 1 plus major depressive disorder. Remember, you can't have a unipolar and a bipolar disorder at the same time. Major depressive disorder is a unipolar mood disorder. Within bipolar 1, major depressive disorder will fit because those are depressive episodes. Because I have the manic episodes, I now have bipolar disorder. So I can't have bipolar 1 and major depressive disorder. Once I have those manic episodes, I'm bipolar 1. Cyclothymic disorder. Cyclothymia is within the normal range, but you just keep vacillating like this over a 2-year period. We're talking about bipolar 1. This person had bipolar 1. You can't switch from bipolar 1 to some other lesser version of it because once you have a manic episode, you're always at risk for another manic episode. Double depression is still a unipolar mood disorder. You cannot have a bipolar disorder and a unipolar disorder at the same time. Okay, so we've talked about that. Let's go ahead and move on to the rest of our lecture. So our agenda for today, we're going to start with an intro to anxiety. Then we're going to talk about generalized anxiety disorder. We'll talk about phobias. We're going to talk about social anxiety, panic attacks, and panic disorder. And then we're going to talk about interventions for anxiety disorders. Please take notes while you're listening to the lecture. Make sure you watch this lecture more than once. I've talked to a lot of people. The individuals who took notes during the lecture, who watched the lecture more than once, did pretty well on quiz number 1. We can go to quiz number 2. It's going to encompass mood disorders and anxiety disorders. So make sure you're boning up on prior content and keeping up with the current content. So what do anxiety disorders have in common? This is a good one right here. Anxiety disorders involve a preoccupation with or a persistent avoidance of thoughts and situations that provoke fear or anxiety. So as with all disorders, anxiety disorders can severely impair a person's life. So for example, somebody might have interference with work due to anxiety. Let's say if a person suffers from agoraphobia, they might not be unable to leave their home and go to perform work. If a person suffers from social phobia, they might not be able to have a satisfying social life. The funny thing is, now during the pandemic, none of us are going to work, or some of us are. Well, very few of us are going to work. Very few of us are going out having a satisfying social life. So anxiety disorders often involve some combination of cognitive, emotional, and behavioral manifestations. Also, this would also include like somatic manifestations. For emotional manifestations, we might think of feelings of intense fear. When we talk about cognitive manifestations, we might be thinking about like the worry, the constantly worrying about things. Behavioral manifestations, this could be like the avoidance of you taking actions to avoid certain things that cause feelings of fear. And then we think about somatic manifestations. Remember, somatic, that means the body, right? So this is like physiological arousal. So we're thinking about like sweating, heart racing. We're thinking about muscle tension. So these would be some of the manifestations of anxiety. How can we distinguish fear from anxiety? So let's think about fear for a second. So right over here, I got a picture of a snake. So you're walking down, you see a snake right in front of you. So both fear and anxiety are emotions, but there are different concepts. The way they operate are different. Fear is an acute response to an immediate threat in the present environment. So this occurs and builds in intensity relatively quickly in response to a specific threat, and this is generally adaptive. So this is like fight or flight or freeze. This might help us get out of or deal with dangerous situations. So think about with like the snake example. So I'm walking around, I see a snake in front of me. Freezing might be a good thing. I'm not approaching the snake. It gives me time to think about what to do next and how to get out of the situation. There could be a flight response where I see the snake, I just turn around and I book it. This is adaptive. I don't want to get bitten by the snake. I see the snake and then I like, screw it, man. I'm talking about like, 2020, baby. I grab a stick. I start beating the snake. I'm talking beating the snake with a stick, right? So this is how fear occurs. Remember, this snake, this is right here, right in front of me. It's a direct threat and it's present right now. In contrast to fear, anxiety is typically thought to be future focused. So this is going to involve thinking about potential threats. So this is like something that is uncertain that may or may not happen, right? So this anxiety, this future focused worry about a potential threat is sustained in duration. So you're worrying about it for longer than a moment. So this is going to be diffuse, in the sense that, worrying about future events, worrying about future problems, this anxiety of how you might respond to these future problems, these what ifs, is diffuse in nature. It's not specific. There's a lot of generalities happening. The thing about anxiety is it's not always maladaptive. It can actually be adaptive in moderation depending on what it is. So for example, if I'm worrying about a trip, this could actually lead to better planning of that trip because this anxiety that I have about traveling, signals me to prepare for it. And this is as opposed to like worrying about a comet hitting the earth. So right over here, I have a picture of a comet hitting the earth. Fun fact, this is some of the paranoia that I would have back in my younger days. I would worry about a random comet or micrometeorite smashing through the ceiling and hitting me in the head. It was terrifying. Remember, this right here, this anxiety over a comet hitting the earth, this is diffuse. Where's a specific threat? Where's what's happening? Neowise was like way out there. So people with anxiety that is maladaptive, they tend to overestimate risk and be fixated on possible negative outcomes. So there's going to be an asteroid that's going to pass close to the Earth. Election night, I believe it's going to pass between the distance of the Earth and the moon. It's not going to hit us. It's going to pass, whiz by. It's no problem. But if I have this anxiety, I might think, well, what if it hits us? Like, how do we know it's not going to hit us? Yada, yada, yada. Also, don't fact check that. Don't go on BuzzFeed and fact check it. I think it's going to be really close, but it might be super far away. Astronomically speaking, an asteroid coming within 1,000,000 miles of Earth is super close. Do you know what I'm talking about? So if I'm overestimating this risk, I could be worrying about this. So from here till November, I'm worrying about this asteroid or this meteor hitting us, whatever. Now, when it comes to anxiety, people with anxiety, their perception of threat is out of proportion to the situation. If I have an anxiety disorder, when I'm thinking about this asteroid that's coming close to Earth, I am thinking like I need to prepare, I need to have fallout shelter, I need to go to the store and buy water and food so I can survive the aftermath. This is out of proportion with the risk of the situation. Here's a little bit of review for you. The primary difference between anxiety and fear is that anxiety is blank, whereas fear is blank. So we have anxiety is oriented towards future threats, whereas fear is oriented towards immediate threats. Anxiety is adaptive, whereas fear is maladaptive. Anxiety is dysfunctional, whereas fear is a protective mechanism. Anxiety is associated with panic attacks, whereas fear is associated with phobias. Anxiety is acute, whereas fear is chronic. Gonna lock in your answer. I'm gonna drink some coffee. The answer was A. The primary difference between anxiety and fear is that anxiety is oriented towards future threats, and fear is oriented towards immediate threats. Oh my gosh. My pronunciation there was all jacked up. Forgive me. You can read. You saw it. You got it there. All right. Anxiety isn't always maladaptive. Fear or anxiety is not like one isn't better than the other. They both have their functions. Anxiety can be adaptive in moderation. So right over here, we have a graph that shows the relationship between arousal, anxiety, and performance, right? So this dictates that performance on a task increases with increased physiological arousal up to a point. So let's think about the anxiety of taking a test, right? If I have no anxiety, what will happen? I don't have any motivation. I probably won't study. I probably won't prepare. I won't read my notes. I won't rewatch the lectures. I won't come to office hours. I won't send emails, right? And then I'll get a low score. So no anxiety, no preparation. If I have super high anxiety, what might happen? This is on the other end. So this is where I cross this anxiety threshold and my performance starts to dip, right? So like what might happen if I have super high anxiety? Maybe I can't concentrate or think enough to study. I'm avoiding studying altogether because it makes me too anxious. And this could also lead to a low score. If I have this moderate level of anxiety, if I hit this sweet point here, that peak, that's the sweet point. That's where my anxiety is helpful because I have enough motivation and alertness to study and perform well without overdoing it. And sometimes this low level of anxiety can be caused by joining cheat groups on GroupMe. So let's look at associative networks. So before we get into the individual anxiety disorders, we want to have an understanding of framework, think about the manifestation and maintenance and treatment of anxiety. So this is going to be known as the associative network model. Concepts are associated in our thinking. When one concept is activated, associated concepts are easily brought to mind. The strengths of these associations range from strong to weak, and one's experience or learning guides how strong these associations are. Take a look right here. So right here, I have an example of a snake, and once I activate this, a bunch of other ideas related to snakes are either strongly or weakly are activated as well. So I have the idea of snakes in my head. So when I think about snakes, I also think about the different types of snakes. When I think of a snake, I think of slimy. Even though snakes aren't slimy, that's just shiny scales. Then I think about snakes are green. When I think about types, I might think about the categories. So like I have like cobras, vipers, sea snakes. When I think about green, I might think about money. I might also think about grass. When I think about slimy, I might think about Eikenberry food. Y'all know what I'm talking about, you know? But y'all ain't getting those swipes today, is ya? No, you sure aren't. So then you have snakes. You might think about snakeskin boots as well. So this is something that's more directly related to snakes because snakeskin boots are made out of snake skin. When I think about snakeskin boots, I might start thinking about fashion. So I might think about like a sale at Macy's or cleaning out my closet. Let's jump back over to the other side when I think about vipers, right? So I might think about vipers the snake, but I also can think about Viper the Six Flags ride. You know, and I love roller coasters and I love Six Flags. And all my friends were planning on going to Six Flags. We were like, oh, we're going to Six Flags. We were like, oh, where are we going to go? Oh, we'll go to Six Flags in the summer. We were really cool. We saved up some money. We were going to go to Six Flags. Then boom, you know what I'm talking about? So no Six Flags for Walter. So I have the Six Flags ride, and that kind of makes me think about summer. Then that kind of makes me think about the plans that I've made, and then the plans connect to money. And see how these are all connected? They kind of all go like this. They loop in and out. They're all associated with one another. So this is a same concept that we have when it comes to fear networks. So specifically, fear networks are associations of objects, meaning, and physiological responses. Objects or stimuli are going to involve aspects of the stimulus itself, such as the kinds of snakes or how they sound. So the meaning of the stimuli is going to involve the attribution a person might give the stimulus. This could be that like snakes are scary, snakes are poisonous, snakes might kill me. The physiological response associated with this stimulus would be something like heart racing, sweating, trembling hands, things like that. So as a result, considering the associations that might, exist in response to a stimulus, a person who has a fear of snakes may be afraid of other things that are somehow associated with snakes, depending on how close the association is and how strongly the fear is. So if I'm afraid of snakes, I might also be afraid of snakeskin boots. I might also be afraid of green things. I might also be afraid of Eikenberry food. I might also be afraid of Six Flags. Do you see what I'm saying there? Right? Those fear networks. We'll talk more about that later. Right over here, this is a little Albert study. I don't know if you all are familiar with this. Very famous study. Wouldn't get passed today, but it got passed back then. As you'll see, this is all in black and white. This is going to be an example of a fear network being constructed. Little Albert, the scientists, the researchers, condition him to be afraid of rats as well as other similar objects. So let's go ahead and let's take a look at this video. I'm going to jump out the way real quick and then we'll watch.
In the early part of the 20th century, psychologists John Watson and Rosalie Rayner set out to teach a baby boy called Little Albert to fear white rats using the principle of classical conditioning. This is a film of their work. The film shows several phases of their study. First, as you see here, the investigators demonstrated that prior to conditioning, Little Albert had no fears of any animals, including, of course, white rats. Watson and Rayner then sought to teach Albert to fear white rats through classical conditioning. In the conditioning phase of the study, which was not filmed, the investigators struck a steel bar with a hammer whenever Albert reached for a rat, making a very loud noise that greatly upset and frightened Albert. After 6 such pairings of the loud noise and the rat, it was believed that the boy had been conditioned to fear white rats. That is, Albert was now expected to react fearfully to white rats whether the rats were paired with loud noises or not. In this next film sequence, we see Albert interacting with a white rat after the conditioning process. The investigators believed that the child's reaction during this trial demonstrated his newly acquired fear of white rats. Finally, the investigators expected that little Albert's conditioned fear of white rats would generalize to stimuli that were similar in key ways to a white rat. In this film segment, they were trying to demonstrate that the child now also reacted fearfully to similar objects, such as a rabbit, a dog, a furry object, and a white mask worn by Watson himself.
All right, so that's the video. Real talk, that was pretty troubling right there. Listen, that dude was coming at me with that mask. Well, even today, bro, like I would be scared. I'm like, bro, what you doing wearing this mask? You know what I'm talking about? And see the way he was dragging that dog around? Listen, you wouldn't be able to get this study like passed nowadays. All right, but that's the little Albert study. Now you're familiar with it. Now you can be traumatized and you know whatever. That's well, man, I feel bad for little Albert. You know what I mean? It's just a baby, right? But think about it. Has anybody ever like thought about what happened to little Albert? No, like usually in person we'll have this discussion about what happened to little Albert. So think about it. What do you think happened to little Albert? A lot of urban legends about little Albert. You know, think about it. Let me know what you think. Let me know in the comments below. Like and subscribe and ring that bell for notifications. All right, let's continue the lecture. So let's talk about epidemiology. Everybody, what does epidemiology mean? There we go. Study of rates, study of prevalences of disease. Remember, we're going to break that word apart. Epidemiology, right? So epi, upon, demi, people, ology, study, upon people, study what befalls upon a people. There we go. We broke it up there for you. Prevalence: anxiety disorders are more common than any other form of mental disorder. There's actually a high comorbidity as well. So what this means is when you have an anxiety disorder, there's a high chance you might have another kind of anxiety disorder. So there's high comorbidity between anxiety disorders. There's also a high comorbidity between anxiety and depression. And there's also a high comorbidity between anxiety and substance use. So think about the reasons for this. Think about why this might be. Between anxiety disorders, right? If I'm already prone to anxiety, right, it stands to reason that I'm at greater risk for an additional anxiety disorder because I already have an anxiety disorder. If I'm scared of one thing, I'm probably more susceptible to being scared of another thing. Let's think about anxiety and depression. If I have like some kind of imbalance, some kind of neurotransmitter issue, or if I experience chronic anxiety, I'm always anxious about everything, that can lead to depression. Think about last lecture, right? We were talking about erosive processes. Anxiety can be an erosive process. This can be something that wears you down over time, makes you feel hopeless for the future, that nothing will change, that things won't get better. Anxiety and substance abuse. Why might this be highly comorbid? Let me hear an answer. Self-medication. You feel nervous, so you have a couple of drinks. You feel really tense, so you do a little bit of this. You know what I'm talking about? You do ooh. Okay, that's enough. All right, but you see what I'm saying? Substance abuse. And also right over here, we also have what anxiety and depression have in common. So what do anxiety and depression have in common? Both of these are defined in terms of negative emotional experiences. And both of these can be triggered by stressful experiences. Right over here, we have the prevalence, the comorbidity, and the commonality between anxiety and depression. Here we're going to look at the tripartite model. This is from Clark and Watson. Let me know if you're interested in this this and I can give you some information on that. All right, so right over here, we have Clark and Watson's tripartite model. And so given that depression and anxiety are highly comorbid, Clark and Watson's model tries to help us to understand why this high overlap, why this comorbidity exists. This started due to researchers noticing that there was an overlap of affective symptoms between depression and anxiety. So additionally, the researchers also argued there's actually relatively specific affective features for each disorder. Here's everybody's favorite Venn diagram from 8th grade. So in the center, we have high negative affect or general distress as being common across both anxiety disorders and depression. So when you think about this negative affect, this general distress, think about things like irritability, feeling upset, feeling unpleasant. So at the same time, anxiety and depression are also thought to be unique from one another. So let's look at depression. Depression, but not anxiety, is thought to be characterized by low levels of positive affect. This would be like a lack of energy, lack of drive, inability to experience pleasure, anhedonia. And anxiety, but not depression, is characterized by higher levels of somatic arousal, increased heart rate, sweating, things like that. The tripartite model also suggests both shared and relatively distinct etiological factors, although both like anxiety and depression are triggered by stressful experiences. These researchers suggest that purely anxious individuals' symptoms were more likely to occur after an event involving danger, lack of security, whereas purely depressed individuals were more likely to have experienced a recent severe loss. So this is like a lack of hope. And then there were mixed cases. So this was individuals who were anxious and depressed, and they frequently reported both types of events. So let me just go over that one more time. So we have pure anxiety, which is thought of having an increased somatic arousal. For purely anxious individuals, these symptoms occur after events involving danger, a lack of security. So pure anxiety, lack of security, increased somatic arousal, increased negative affect as well. Purely depressed individuals, reduced positive affect, increased negative affect as well. So this pure depression was thought to have occurred due to a recent loss, a lack of hope from this recent loss. That could be a death of a loved one, a divorce, a loss of a job, a loss of a title or position, things like that. Then we have mixed cases. These are individuals that experience increased somatic arousal, reduced positive affect, increased negative affect, who've both experienced lack of security and lack of. Here's a little bit of review. Which of the following is true regarding ideas behind Clark and Watson's tripartite model? Okay, so A, it helps explain why there is a high degree of overlap between depression and anxiety. B, depression but not anxiety is associated with high levels of negative affect. C, anxiety but not depression is associated with low levels of positive affect. D, pure depression tends to develop because of stressful events involving danger. E, pure anxiety tends to develop from chronic life issues. So which one of those statements is true? A, B, C, D, or E? All right, this is a video, so like you can just pause and think about it. But I'm gonna go ahead and give the answer. There we go. It is A. It helps to explain why there is a high degree of overlap between depression and anxiety. All righty, so let's move forward. Let's look at generalized anxiety disorder according to the DSM-5. Here's a situation here. In the reading folder, which I can tell most of you aren't opening because I can see how many people have viewed the documents, I have a chapter from the DSM-5 in PDF format for you for those who haven't yet created a library account or accessed the online DSM-5. If you want to get an A on the quiz, I'm looking right at you, you will need to read these DSM-5 chapters for yourself. I will not cover the entire DSM-5 chapter in the lecture. It is one of the readings. It is in the reading folder. Reading chapters is normal. I would suggest that you read that chapter. Remember, a C's a degree, and that's all right with me. Generalized anxiety disorder is known as the basic anxiety disorder, and this is because it generalizes to a lot of things. Specifically, when it comes to diagnosis, excessive worry is going to be the most significant component of this disorder. But this worry is not just confined to one area of life. This worry must apply to 2 or more areas. This could be school, family, friends, work, health, etc. Okay? So excessive worry must must occur more days than not for a period of at least 6 months. You'll notice some themes between these disorders. Whenever I say more days than not, that means at least 51% of the day. So the majority of days you have to have these symptoms. So it's not just like once in a while, it's more days than not for at least 6 months. Now, the individual must also find this excessive worry difficult to control. What does this mean? Let's say if I get worried, if I'm worried about a test, I'd be like, no, it's okay. Let me just go ahead and study real quick. Let me read the chapter. I'll be fine. That's not anxiety. That's not excessive worry, because I felt worried about the quiz, but then I studied and then the worry went away. Somebody with anxiety disorder, generalized anxiety disorder, will find it difficult to control the worry. So this excessive anxiety and worry, this apprehensive expectation, this must occur more days than not for at least 6 months about a number of events or activities. So multiple domains, work, school. The individual must find it difficult to control the worry. The anxiety and worry is associated with 3 or more of the following 6 symptoms, with at least some symptoms having been present for more days than not for the past 6 months. So these symptoms are going to be feelings of restlessness or being keyed up or on edge, tiredness and feeling easily fatigued, difficulty concentrating or the mind going blank, irritability, muscle aches and tensions, and sleep problems. Think about those symptoms. What do you notice about those symptoms? What do you notice about those symptoms? They seem kind of familiar. Where have you seen these symptoms before? Some of these symptoms: restlessness, keyed up on edge, tiredness, fatigue, difficulty concentrating, irritability, sleep problems. Some of this kind of sounds like depression. But what's the key difference here between depression and anxiety? Oh yeah, the excessive fear or worry, lasting for at least 6 months. Whereas with depression, how long must my symptoms last to be considered an episode? At least 2 weeks. All right. For these symptoms here, the individual with these symptoms might realize that they are excessive. They might realize that they're unreasonable, but they just can't stop. So telling someone who has generalized anxiety disorder to just like chill out, that's not going to help them. They are incapable in this current state of controlling. They need support and help in order to control these feelings, which we'll get into a little bit later. So let's talk about etiology. Who remembers what etiology means? Who remembers etiology? Who remembers that? Etiology is the study of causes. All right, so now we're going to talk about the etiology of GAD. So these are going to be hypothesized etiological factors. Remember, etiology is the study of causes. So anxiety as a personality trait does seem to run in families, but the diagnosis of GAD, that seems to be a little bit less conclusive that that runs in families. So look at these concordance rates. So we have 0.28 for monozygotic twins, 0.17 for dizygotic twins. There's a difference in those numbers. It's a significant difference. So it shows that there's some kind of heritability there. It's a very small difference. So maybe there's a little bit of environmental and genetic influence at play there. We don't know. We need more information. And then in addition to this, we have to think about the environmental risk factors that are unique to individuals. And these environmental risk factors appear to influence the development of all anxiety disorders. Now remember, these unique environmental risk factors are different from the shared environment of like the familial household. It is likely that something in the environment of the individual, we're still talking about the twin pairs here. So like the amount of stress in their lives, having children, switching schools, ending a relationship, being a grad student. These specific factors, these unique individualized factors, seem to have a greater influence than the shared environment. If that didn't make sense, read the DSM-5. There's the issue of comorbidity of generalized anxiety disorder is very controversial in the literature. So some researchers actually suggest that generalized anxiety disorder, we'll call it GAD from now on, is often a pre-existing condition for people who later develop other anxiety disorders, and other researchers actually question the temporal sequence of the development of GAD and other anxiety disorders. So what is a temporal sequence? For those of you who've watched Tenet, it is the order of things. What came first, the chicken or the egg? That's a temporal sequence. Temporal pincer movement. What came first, the anxiety disorder or the GAD or the anxiety disorder? Now moving on to intolerance of uncertainty. So intolerance of uncertainty, this describes a characteristic that results from a set of negative beliefs about uncertainty and its implications. And this also involves the tendency to react negatively on an emotional, cognitive, and behavioral level to uncertain situations and events. So basically, this individual who has intolerance tolerance of uncertainty is basically they find ambiguous situations to be stressful or upsetting. So this is like a good example of this is when someone sends me an email and they ask me what's going to be on the quiz, and I say everything from, the intro material. And then they say, well, what's in the intro material? I'm like, it could be anything. Well, what questions are going to be on the quiz? Anything from the first couple of weeks. What should I study for? What should I learn? Well, pretty much all of it. That kind of information, that ambiguity can be very stressful and upsetting. Okay. All right. So additionally, individuals with generalized anxiety disorder often have positive beliefs about the function that worrying serves them. They believe that worry will help them cope with feared events more effectively or prevent those events from occurring at all, therefore preventing panic. If you have GAD, you might realize that your worry is excessive. You might realize that your worry is unreasonable, but you're like, but look, when I worry about the exam, I study all night. I reread all my notes. I watch the lecture 45 times, and then I get a 98%. So obviously, my worry is working for me. Look, I stay up all night. I write all these papers. I'm super stressed out about things, but look, I keep getting promoted at work. Everything's working out for me. Yes, there's stress. Yes, there's worry. Yes, I get all that, but look how great things are working out for me. So in the eye of the individual with GAD, oftentimes they view their anxiety as being adaptive, a competitive edge. Okay, so therefore, due to this view of anxiety being adaptive, they are more willing to avoid any information that might be perceived as threatening to that view, and then their feelings of worry are more likely to continue. And so this is actually not going to be adaptive for the individual. The chronic worry has negative effects on the body. This can actually affect various domains of somebody's life. So let's think about some of the physiological symptoms of anxiety that might be detrimental to somebody's life. So you're talking about the arousal, feeling tense, the muscle tension, right? That tension that you're holding in your shoulders and your lower back. You're thinking about the heart racing, cardiovascular issues. There's always different things that might happen. And over time, this anxiety, this excessive worry is going to have cumulative effects. So in a long enough timeline, this is not going to be good for the person. And so sometimes individuals might think, well, just for now, just so I can get through this class, so I can get through grad school, so I can get my tenure, they think I can endure this. But there's always seems to be something moving forward that they have to endure this anxiety in order to achieve this goal. All right, so let's talk about epidemiology for GAD. Epidemiology, the study of rates, prevalence, generalized anxiety disorder. There is a 2-to-1 male to female ratio for GAD. So females are twice as likely to be diagnosed with GAD than males. Why might this be? Is this due to some physiological difference? Maybe. Is this due to hormones, neurotransmitters? Maybe. Could this be sociological? Males are socialized to process worry differently? Possibly. Could this be from underreporting by males due to toxic masculinity? Perhaps. There's a variety of explanations that researchers have gone over. For approximately 5% of the population meets criteria for GAD. The onset of GAD is typically in adolescence, so between the ages of 10 to 19, as well as people over 40, and this is particularly prevalent in females in response to a life stressor. The final thing I want you to remember is that with GAD, there's going to be a high overlap with other disorders. What were some of the disorders we talked about earlier? There's going to be high overlap with depression, and for generalized anxiety disorder, you're also at risk for other anxiety disorders. Good job. So now let's talk about the DSM-5 criteria for specific phobia. So we talked a little bit about phobias earlier when we were talking about the fear networks, right? We're talking about the snakes and everything. So let's get more into it. So specific phobia is going to involve excessive or unreasonable fear related to specific objects and situations that interferes with functioning. The event or object almost always causes immediate fear or anxiety. The individual avoids the event or object. The fear, anxiety is out of proportion to the actual threat, and the fear, anxiety, or avoidance is persistent, typically lasting for 6 months or more. This fear that the individual is experiencing, this could present itself as increased heart rate, heart palpitations, dizziness, unsteadiness. Think about nausea, sweating, shaking, trembling, feeling of having this upset stomach, being out of breath, breathlessness. This marked fear or anxiety about specific objects or situation. This is going to be like flying, heights, animals, public speaking, receiving an injection, seeing blood. This phobic situation that they have right here, whenever this comes up, they're almost always going to almost always cause fear or anxiety. The individual is going to actively avoid the situation, or they're going to endure this situation with intense fear and anxiety. Keep in mind, I'm doing some review here, but keep in mind, this fear, this anxiety is going to be out of proportion to the actual danger posed by the specific object or situation and to the cultural context. This fear, anxiety, or avoidance will be persistent for 6 months or more. There's going to be 5 subtypes or categories of specific phobias. We have animal type. There's kynophobia. That's going to be fear of dogs. Who's going to be scared of that little guy? Look at that guy. He's cute, man. You know what I'm talking about? But hey, you know what? You ever seen a police dog? That's scary, bro. You know what I'm saying? You could have fear of the natural environment. So this is like the natural subtype. So this would be like acrophobia, fear of heights. You ever see those videos? This is the Burj Khalifa, right? But you ever see those videos where like people be like climbing on top of buildings on YouTube and they're like jumping back and forth between the balconies, or they're doing that thing where they're like this on the guardrail? Or I saw some picture on Twitter where this dude was like hanging his girlfriend off a cliff and he was like, "What's stopping you and your partner from doing this?" I'm like, bro, a prefrontal cortex, man. You know what I'm saying? So that's that one right there. We're gonna go ahead and stay focused here. So you can also have blood injection or injury type. So for example, you could have trypanophobia. Yeah, trypanophobia. Okay, this is gonna be fear of needles. So that's gonna be, you're gonna have like this strong response to seeing blood, having injections, sustaining bodily injuries, or watching surgery. If you don't like Dr. Pimple Popper, this could be why. So far, these 3 subtypes I talked about, they all emerge in childhood. All right, so far. But blood injection injury type emerges in childhood, but it also runs in families. So now we're going to go to situational type. This could be like aviophobia. This is like fear of flying. So this could be fear of a particular situation, such as being in an airplane or elevator or enclosed space. And this might arise in childhood, but it usually has like a later onset, like in your mid-20s. And then the next one, other type. So right over here, you got something like chorophobia, fear of clowns. I used to call it just bozophobia because of Bozo the Clown. And if you've never heard of Bozo the Clown, look it up. Just look it up. But don't blame me. Because it's not required. But if you look up Bozo the Clown, you can see why I used to call it bozophobia. All right. And this also includes like any other specific phobia. Does not fall into the animal, natural, blood injection, or situational subtype. So this could be like a fear of falling down when not near wall or other support. This could be like a fear of costume characters. This is like me with Santa Claus when I was 4 years old. Santa Claus is creepy because Santa Claus lives in the North Pole with a bunch of elves, flies around on a magical sleigh, dropping presents on people. He sneaks into your chimney and eats your cookies and drinks your milk. So when I was a kid, I was scared of Santa Claus. Totally normal. And you could also have like phobic avoidance of situations that might lead to choking, vomiting, or contracting the illness. Those are all fall under other subtype or specific phobias. So the most common phobias are snakes and heights. People with these phobias for snakes and heights often have panic attacks in regards to this. So let's move on to the etiology of specific phobia. What does etiology mean? That's right, the study of the causes of a disorder. Good job. All right, so there's going to be a number of theories associated with the development of phobias. So some of which you might already be familiar with from like Psych 101 or AP Psych, for some of y'all. So first, there's going to be the preparedness model. And this indicates that there are some things that we are naturally afraid of because it leads to an evolutionary advantage. So basically, this means that less learning from experience is required to gain a fear response to something. And this could be like why children are so easily afraid of the dark, because it is an evolutionary advantage to be afraid of the dark, because thousands and thousands of years ago, when we were living on the plains of Africa as early humans, when it was dark, it was dark. You know what I'm talking about? It was pitch black, Vin Diesel. And it was one of those, it was very scary because there's saber-toothed tigers and woolly mammoths and 4-foot spiders walking all over the place. Not the 4-foot spider part, but you know what I'm talking about. The spiders were big, okay? It was an evolutionary advantage for you to be afraid of the dark. These fears can rapidly or more easily become phobias because they already have some sort of evolutionary adaptive advantage until, of course, it becomes more excessive. All right, so for this preparedness model, direct exposure is actually not necessary. So you could actually receive negative information from parents or television. So for example, you might have a fear of walking alone at night due to news reports about different kinds of violence that occurs at night. This could be an evolutionary advantage for you to be safe at night, to be physically secure, to avoid attack is an evolutionary trait that human beings carry for self-preservation. Hearing this information about how dangerous it is at night could help you go along the preparedness model pathway and allow you to develop a quickly or more easily develop a phobia for walking around at night. Let's go ahead and move on to social learning. So this is going to be the idea that you can learn fear from watching others' responses to a stimulus. This will be represented in a study that actually found that baby monkeys learn from adult monkeys to be afraid of snakes. This is a way that you can think of like social learning as being very similar to classical conditioning. So classical conditioning, as you remember from Pavlov's dogs, is something that is learned from a repeated pairing of a particular stimulus and a negative response. This is like the little Albert video that we saw. This is going to be a demonstration of classical conditioning where he learned a fear response associated with objects and characteristics similar to the right rat. There's actually some other ways that this can present itself. You might also think of this being a way that pair different associations or fear responses to different races or ethnicities. So we could slowly but surely teach our children to be afraid of, Black people, Latinos, other races based on the way that we act, like crossing the street, or maybe like squeezing the hand, clutching our purse in the elevator. These associations that this stimulus, this Black man walks in, like I look at my mother seems distressed. This Black man must have caused this distress. I conform the association that way. There's research on that. We have operant conditioning. In case of phobia, this is going to be a behavior that is learned through the reduction of anxiety, particularly through negative reinforcement. Negative reinforcement here primarily means that the fear or stimulus is going to be reinforced through avoidance of that stimulus because it reduces anxiety. So this is going to be engaging in a behavior that takes away or avoids an aversive stimulus or outcome. So let's think about that. Negative reinforcement. You remove the fear or anxiety by avoiding a stimulus. Negative reinforcement might be taking the stairs instead of taking the elevator. Negative reinforcement might be walking instead of taking the bus. Negative reinforcement might be wearing a mask and avoiding going to the grocery store. Like you remove something, you change your behavior to reduce that stimulus. Just like in that example about racism we were talking about earlier, this could be the crossing of the street. So you cross the street because you decide that you don't want to walk past someone who looks different from you. Negative reinforcement. All right, now we got some more review for you. So we saw a video of little Albert, a little boy who learned to fear white rats and objects with similar characteristics because of a loud noise that was paired with the presentation of a white rat. Which of the following etiological theories best explains this principle or this example? Is it going to be A, the preparedness model, B, social learning, C, classical conditioning, D, operant conditioning, E, shampoo and conditioning? If you choose E, I swear. You know what? I'm not even going to lie. Some of you probably would choose E. I'm just going to put it out. I saw the quizzes. Let's take a look here. C, classical conditioning. All right, great job, everybody. Here we have DSM-5 specific phobia epidemiology. So let's go ahead and take a look right here. Specific phobia is the most common form of anxiety disorder. The 12-month prevalence of specific phobia is roughly 9% of the population, and the lifetime prevalence is roughly 12% of the population. Women are 2 to 3 times more likely to experience specific phobias than men. However, the rates are different across phobic stimuli. So for example, animal, natural environment, and situational specific phobias are more common in women, but blood injection injury type is experienced nearly equally by men and women. When you look at the breakdown of specific phobia, so right over here, this bar chart, that 9% is specific phobia overall, but I've broken it down into the 4 specific phobia subtypes. You'll see that animal subtype is the most common, and this typically begins in childhood. However, most of these specific phobias can actually arise unexpectedly, usually in adolescent or early adulthood based on a bad situation or a specific encounter with a different stimuli. All right, so now we've got a little comic here for you. This we're over here talking about real life horror movies. All right, so we have like the dreaded phone call. Why don't you just text? I feel that for real. real. That's me all the time. There's the unexpected guests, you know, they were in the neighborhood, so they just dropped by. You know what? Let me tell you something. Never just drop by. Never ever just drop by. That's such a bad thing. I don't know where that comes from. I was just in the neighborhood. I think I'll come back. No, don't do that. All right, those people over there are laughing. They must be laughing at you. Oh, that's pretty terrifying, right? You ever had that happen to you? That happens to me when I lecture in class sometimes. Like I'll be lecturing, they'd be like in the back, you know how that goes, and they're like laughing about everything. And I think, are they laughing at me? But then I'm like, I'm 30 something, you know, they ain't worried about it. You know what I'm talking about? Ain't worried about it. All right. And then we have attack of the overly chatty waiters. Yeah, so you want to eat, but they want to talk. Yo, this is real nowadays too. Do you know what I mean? Like I live over by Courier Cafe and I'd be walking down the street and I see them people just out there chatting, touching people's shoulders and stuff. I'm like, man, don't you touch me. If I go out to eat, you better just deliver that food with the mask on and dip out. All right. So, but you know, this is actually, I put all this stuff together a couple years ago, but nowadays there's like other things to worry about. So real life horror movie, you know, you're freaking out. You're like, what's the matter? I forgot my mask. It's like, oh no, what am I doing? You know what I'm talking about? Boom, right over here. Check keys, wallet. Oh no, I left my mask. Hey, am I gonna get in trouble for this F-bomb? Who cares? Y'all's over age of 18. Come on, you know what I'm talking about. All right, there we go. This is real life horror story. All right, there we go. So let's look at social phobia, also known as social anxiety disorder. Social phobia is going to be much different from shyness or introversion. So this is going to encompass a marked and persistent fear or anxiety about one or more social situations in which a person is exposed to possible scrutiny by others. Examples of this include social interactions, having a conversation, meeting unfamiliar people, also like being observed, eating or drinking, or being evaluated professionally, performing in front of other people. So this could be like giving a lecture, stand-up comedy, slam poetry, stuff like that. Individuals with social anxiety disorder might fear that they could act in a way that would show their anxiety symptoms and end up being negatively evaluated. So this is going to be like humiliating or embarrassing and will lead to rejection or might even like offend other people. So doing like a social faux pas, something like that. The social situations almost always provoke fear or anxiety. The social situations are avoided or endured with intense fear or anxiety. The fear is out of proportion to the actual threat posed by the social situation and to the socio-cultural context. This fear can actually be applied, can be like specifically applied to a situation, or it can be generalized if it applies to a variety of social situations. So let's think about it. What are some of the social situations you've encountered that have caused anxiety? Do they always cause anxiety every time? Does thinking about it cause anxiety every time? That's what you're thinking about. You're looking at social anxiety, social phobia. So this is different from being nervous about presenting in front of class. This is going to be a deep fear or anxiety, a more pervasive fear and anxiety, and it's going to be stable across time. And what I mean by that is you're afraid of speaking in front of class, you give a presentation, you do well, you feel good about it, you move on. The next time you give a presentation, you feel better about it, and so forth. This is where every single time it becomes crippling. Review. So Winston feels nervous prior to a presentation in class because he is worried about getting a good grade. This nervousness is associated with sweaty palms. How would a clinician interpret this? Generalized anxiety disorder? Specific phobia? Social phobia? Generalized phobia disorder? None of the above. All right, think about it. It's a video. You can pause it. You're probably not even paying attention, actually. You're probably like doing something else. I don't know. Anyways, answer E. None of the above. Walter, what are you talking about? Well, what do I have here? I have one example of one situation, right? So let's look at the situation first. Winston feels nervous prior to a presentation in class because he is worried about getting a good grade. Has this happened before? How many times has this occurred? Well, let's think about what he's doing. So he's given a presentation in class and he's worried about getting a good grade. Is the worry out of proportion to the activity? So if you take an exam, you're probably worried about a grade. Seems reasonable enough. This is the only time this has happened based on this information, right? The nervousness is associated with sweaty palms. Sweaty palms? Just sweaty palms? Nothing else? I don't have enough information here to do a diagnosis. I need more information. So if this is confusing to you, do me a quick favor. Pause the video, go to the DSM-5 chapter and read up on it. All right, cool beans. So now let's talk about social phobia and let's look at some epidemiology and some etiology. So this is going to be some quick stats for you. For social phobia, a lifetime prevalence is going to be 12%. Social phobia is more common in females. This sex difference is stronger in childhood and adolescence. Now, so when it comes to sex differences, researchers suggest that these differences might be related to the self-construal theory, whereby women's sense of self may be more dependent on others because of socialization. For females, might be interdependent more than it is for males. Females might be impacted by interpersonal interactions more than males, and females may be more likely to report social anxiety as opposed to males. So in terms of etiology or causes of social phobia, classical conditioning has been applied here as well, where people who have previously had negative experiences such as teasing or being in social and performance situations might fear it now. So alternatively, you have the preparedness model. So this refers to the idea that there are some things we are naturally afraid of because it leads to an evolutionary advantage. So it's been argued that this could be a possible cause for social phobia, since it makes sense to be afraid of judgment and social exclusion because we need others to survive. However, some researchers contend that this doesn't make sense because evolutionarily speaking, you generally need social bonds to survive, and therefore avoiding social contact would not be adaptive, evolutionary speaking. So there's going to be a mix of views when it comes to the preparedness model. So now we have some cognitive biases for social phobia. People with social anxiety tend to focus on negative things in their environment. They think negative interactions happen all the time because that's all they remember and look for. So this would be like they're looking for people not making eye contact, not smiling. This is important. Perception is reality for some people, or for most people actually. If you are always focused on negative stimuli, you will have a negative experience. It's okay to look for negative stimuli, but if all you're focused on is the negative aspects of an interaction, when you leave that interaction, you're just going to take away the negative events. Memory plays another role. So people with social anxiety tend to selectively remember negative things. So for example, they might have an easy time remembering when presentations go poorly, but having a hard time remembering when they went well. And this applies to a lot of other things as well. This applies to like negative interactions with people. You remember the negative interactions, you forget the positive interactions. Or, you have a bad experience with somebody, and then you forever label them as being a certain type of person when you've had plenty of positive experiences before. So judgment. This judgment involves a person determining how likely certain outcomes are and what the costs and benefits would be of these certain interactions. People with social anxiety tend to have a biased belief that negative outcomes are more likely or inevitable and that the cost associated with them is high. So you might think, okay, this is like me in middle school. You might think that if you go across the dance and ask somebody to dance, they're going to reject you. And if they reject you, that everybody's going to laugh at you and you're going to be socially ostracized. So then you always believe that walking across the room to talk to somebody is going to lead to social ostracization. So right over here, this nice little example of those cognitive biases. You have all this positivity and you're just like, whatever, I don't care. And then someone gives you one negative comment and you're like, oh my God, that's true about me. This is me. This is actually a lot of instructors. You receive a lot of positive feedback and then you receive like one negative feedback and then you worry about it. One of my professors gave me a good tip. He flipped it and was like, focus on the students that are engaged, focus on the students that are having positive experiences. Don't let one person ruin your whole day. Let that person say what they have to say, send them on their way. You never have to interact with them ever again. True or false? A little bit of review right here. Let's take a look. Having panic attacks means you have a panic disorder. We haven't covered panic attacks yet, have we? No. So this is just me asking you, what do you think? Having panic attacks means you have a panic disorder. It's actually false. There's a lot more involved with panic attacks, which we will get into coming up on the next slide. So panic attacks can be experienced as part of several different disorders, but they're most central to panic disorder. Now, just because an individual has experienced panic attacks doesn't necessarily mean that they have a panic disorder. So let's take a look at panic attacks real quick here. So panic attacks are going to be marked by an abrupt experience of intense fear. The symptoms are going to be sudden and they're going to peak quickly. Though this experience of intense fear is going to be accompanied by physical symptoms. This could be heart palpitations or chest pain. In addition to having this abrupt, intense fear, these additional symptoms are, like I said, the palpitations, pounding, heart rate, talking about sweating, chills, hot flashes, trembling, shaking, dizziness, sensations of being short of breath or smothering, feelings of being choked, chest pain or discomfort, nausea or abdominal distress, fear of losing control, or this sensation that I'm going to go crazy. This abrupt surge can happen from either a calm or an anxious state. So what differentiates isolated panic attacks from panic disorder is that panic disorder encompasses recurrent, unexpected panic attacks. In other words, they show up over and over again, and they come out of the blue in situations you wouldn't expect to be fearful in. In addition, after one of the panic attacks, the individual experiences either of the following for at least 1 month. So you're going to have persistent concern or worry about experiencing another attack or the consequences of the attack. So, for example, someone might say that they experienced a panic attack in the elevator, but then after that, they started worrying, what if it happens again? If I experience another panic attack, what, like, these symptoms that I'm experiencing, the sweating, the heart rate, I start worrying that, like, oh man, I'm starting to sweat. Maybe I'm going to have a panic attack again. You start having that flashback, like, oh no, this is how I felt when I had my panic attack. I was sweating, I was worrying, my heart was racing, and now I feel like I'm going to have one again. Then you can also have behavioral changes to avoid panic attacks. So you have somebody who was on an elevator, they had a panic attack, so now they're going out of their way to avoid elevators or other enclosed spaces. So this is like they're taking the stairs instead. Or let's say if someone decides that they want to avoid feeling increased heart rate or avoid feeling like sweaty, that they stop exercising because that exercising makes them sweat, makes their heart race, which is how they felt when they were having the panic attack. This avoidance also includes significant maladaptive changes in behavior related to the attacks. Another way to think about this is that the behaviors designed to avoid having a panic attack, such as exercise or unfamiliar situations, might be maladaptive in nature. So think about it this way. Let's say, well, I had a panic attack in the elevator, so I'm afraid of elevators. So now I take the stairs. My office is on the 78th floor. Or the doctor says, I need to exercise more to control my diabetes or my high blood pressure. But every time I exercise, I think I'm having a panic attack. So then I don't. Even though I know exercise is good for me, I avoid it. Big remember here, panic attacks are necessary for diagnosis of panic disorder, but they are insufficient by themselves. So just because you have a panic attack does not mean you have a panic disorder. You need to have that concern and worry about having another panic attack or behavioral changes to avoid another panic attack. Now, when I'm looking at the diagnostic criteria for panic disorder, I need to make sure that I understand that within 1 month of that panic attack, that persistent worry or behavioral change occurred. Go ahead and go to the DSM-5, look up the panic disorders, familiarize yourself with that chapter, and then let's go ahead and move forward. All right, so right over here, we have our favorite clinician again. This video example is going to involve somebody who is describing panic disorder. I know you went to the DSM-5 and read all the symptoms and all the diagnostic criteria. I know you did that. So now while you're watching this video, you should be listening for those symptoms and the diagnostic criteria.
Stuff going on at work and you're feeling a bit stressed out and you're in town, it was a bit hot. And so that may have been what was behind that very first panic attack. What happens to people is that once they've had one panic attack, they go on to have more. And the reason for that is that once you've had something like that happen to you, you're kind of there thinking, ooh, will this happen again? Is that something that you do?
Oh, absolutely. I've started to really monitor my heart, and when it starts to race, I start to get worried, and then it starts getting faster and faster, so it does feel...
That's yes. You're describing it exactly, Julie. That's what we call hypervigilance. So you're there kind of keeping a bit of an eye on your heart.
Definitely.
And for most of us, our heart rate will go up and down all through the day, but most of us don't worry about it because we don't notice it.
Right.
But because you've had a panic attack, you're there thinking, oh, what's my heart doing? And then the minute it starts to change, you clock it, you notice it. And then you start to get anxious thoughts. So you might
start worrying, I really do.
Start worrying. So
I keep thinking, is it going to be now? you know, is my heart going to stop beating?
Right, so you get those kind of
Yes,
anxious
yeah,
thoughts, and they're very
yeah.
frightening.
Very.
And because you're thinking, my goodness me, could my heart stop? That makes you even more anxious, and that causes even more adrenaline to be released.
Right.
And that makes the symptoms even more pronounced, and then that makes you believe even more that there's something wrong with you. Does that make sense as to what might be happening?
It does make sense, Doctor.
One of the things that you have been doing, which is something that a lot of people with anxiety do, is that you've started to avoid doing things that trigger it off.
I have, yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, like not walking into town or anything. I just won't do it anymore.
Exactly. And whilst in the short term that sort of alleviates your symptoms because you don't have to get panicky, what's happening is that the more you avoid doing things, the less likely you are to ever get round to finding out whether or not anything awful really happens.
Right.
Okay.
Yeah. Right.
Does that make sense?
It does make sense.
So now let's talk about agoraphobia. Agoraphobia is often related to panic disorder. And in fact, before the DSM-5, panic disorder used to be classified with or without agoraphobia. But recently, these disorders have been separated from each other. So that is, panic disorder and agoraphobia are now two separate disorders in the DSM-5. The essential feature of agoraphobia is anxious apprehension about being in places or situations from which escape might be difficult or embarrassing, or help may be unavailable if one has a panic attack. So let's think about some situations like these. So typically, these feared situations are crowded streets, shops, enclosed spaces, theaters, churches, public transportation, driving on bridges, being in tunnels, crowded expressways, other situations like that. According to DSM-5, you must have two or more of these situations in order to have agoraphobia. The fear is going to be out of proportion to the situation. So for example, if I'm afraid of being alone at night walking around the street, this might be legit if I'm in a neighborhood that I'm unfamiliar with, or if I live in like a high crime area. That could be a place where that fear is legit. But let's say if I'm in my house, walking through the long hallway, and that kind of crippling fear might not be commensurate to the situation. Or if I'm at the office and I'm in the break room and I'm really afraid of it because it's so tight, that might not be commensurate. So agoraphobia, the word itself means the fear of the marketplace. So these kind of public spaces people are afraid of, they could have different situations. So it could be like concerts, it could be public gatherings, things like that could trigger this fear. When I'm thinking about agoraphobia based on the DSM-5 criteria, I want to think about what's required to achieve this diagnosis. According to DSM-5, this marked fear or anxiety present about two or more situations. So this is going to be transportation, open spaces, enclosed spaces, standing in line, being in a crowd, being outside their home alone. So the individual will fear or avoid these situations because there's a thought that escape might be difficult or help might not be available if they have a panic attack. The individual will also view these panic attack-like symptoms as being incapacitating or potentially embarrassing. Now, avoidance of these situations can be behavioral, such as finding a different job that doesn't require public transportation, or cognitive, which could be distracting yourself mentally while you're using public transportation. In order to achieve agoraphobia, these agoraphobic situations must almost always provoke fear or anxiety in the individual with agoraphobia. These situations are actively avoided. These agoraphobic situations require the presence of a companion. These agoraphobic situations are endured with intense fear or anxiety. Now remember that the fear, anxiety, or avoidance is persistent, and it typically lasts for 6 months or more. In most severe cases, individuals may be stuck at home, so about 1/3 of individuals with agoraphobia don't leave the house, and these individuals rely on others for basic needs, or they rely on others for comfort, security. And with agoraphobia, especially individuals who are homebound, there's a common experience with depression and also a common prevalence of substance abuse as individuals try to self-medicate. So when we're thinking about agoraphobia, think about some of the situations someone might be in that you've heard of for agoraphobia. Some people have heard that individuals with agoraphobia never leave their home. About a third of them do. So right over here, we have another practice question for you. So Karen has had great difficulty going to work ever since she had a panic attack while at work. In order to determine whether Karen had a panic disorder or social anxiety, we would need to find out whether A, she feared contamination or feared panic attacks cued by work stress. B, she had panic attacks because of difficult work or because of on-the-job trauma. C, she worried about how much work is affecting her relationships or feels uneasy looking out of the window of her office on the 7th floor. D, she was concerned about having another panic attack or was concerned about being embarrassed or humiliated in front of others. E, she had an unpleasant interaction and then asked to speak to the manager. So which one is A, B, C, D, or E? The answer is D. Karen has had great difficulty going to work ever since she had a panic attack while at work. In order to determine whether Karen had a panic disorder or social anxiety, we would need to find out whether she was concerned about having another panic attack or concerned about being embarrassed or humiliated in front of others. You see the differences there? Remember, a panic attack does not mean a panic disorder, right? Unless you have a worry or fear about having another panic attack and the consequences of that panic attack, or you're making behavioral changes to avoid that panic attack. And then the social social anxiety. This involves some kind of fear or worry about being judged by others. All right, so right over here, we have a little comic there with some more funny little examples of anxiety, worrying about thinking someone's mad at you without any evidence, thinking of some random impossible scenario, hearing a single loud noise, and also just literally nothing. When you look at it, the things that we're worried about are represented by these little kitties, and these little kitties are harmless. And of course, I'm on my quarantine tip. So right over here, something else, that disappointment when you're halfway to the store and then you realize you forgot your mask. And for me, I walk to the store, and this always happens when I'm like halfway through my apartment. I'm like, oh no, I gotta get my mask. And there is something to be anxious about. So cognitive theories of panic disorder focus on individuals' interpretations of bodily sensations. And this is because panic attacks are usually triggered by internal stimuli. So let's think about why this is. So individuals who experience panic disorder engage in maladaptive interpretations of physical sensations that in turn feed back into increased anxiety and fear. So in other words, there is a negative feedback loop between physical sensations and anxiety and fear. That being said, people with panic disorder may have high anxiety sensitivity, which refers to individual differences in the level of fear that people experience in response to sensations or behaviors associated with anxiety. So this could be better described as the fear of fear. Now, people higher in anxiety sensitivity may be more likely to think that their heart racing, sweating is indicative of something really bad happening. So when you think about it this way, the experience of fear and anxiety plus the associated physical symptoms like the heart racing, the palpitations, the sweating, might lead to interpretation of the physical symptoms as being worse. So you might think about like somebody who is saying, oh, there's something wrong with my heart. I could literally die. And this could increase fear and anxiety and also worsen these physical symptoms. So you're thinking, oh no, my heart's racing, I'm sweating, must be having a heart attack. When you're worried about that, your heart starts pumping harder, you start sweating more, and then you get increasingly distressed about that. This makes it worse, and this could lead to a sensation where you're thinking, oh no, I'm dying. Another factor that can contribute to panic disorder is something that we call interoceptive awareness. Now, interoceptive awareness refers to your ability to sense your internal body state. So individuals may be prone to panic disorder if they are paying a lot of attention to, and thus they might be more sensitive to small changes in bodily sensations, like the heart rate we were talking about earlier. So ultimately, normal body sensations might be interpreted as something that is very wrong in the individual. And the combination of being hypersensitive to these normal changes and the interpretation of these bodily changes as harmful or threatening can lead to panic attacks. So now let's think about somebody who is breathing heavily after walking up the stairs. So they might interpret this as something being wrong with them because they're having trouble breathing. This interpretation could lead to increased physiological symptoms, breathing heavier, having a heart that is racing, beating harder. And this sensation right here could lead to a panic attack. Now, there are also individual differences in the tendencies to notice and interpret bodily sensations in a way that increases risk for panic disorder. So anxiety sensitivity and interoceptive awareness are two of these factors that contribute to panic disorder. So we talked about both of these, but here's a quick review. Anxiety sensitivity is going to be the individual differences in the level of fear that people experience in response to sensations or behaviors associated with anxiety. The fear of fear. So people higher in anxiety sensitivity may be more likely to think that their heart is racing, that the sweat that they are feeling is something that is indicative of a panic attack. Quick review on interoceptive awareness. This refers to your ability to sense your internal body state. Individuals may be prone to anxiety, especially if they are paying a lot of attention to, and thus they are more sensitive to, small changes in bodily sensations. So this could be noticing small fluctuations in heart rate in combination with anxiety sensitivity. So interoceptive awareness, anxiety sensitivity can work together to increase the chances of a panic disorder forming. All right, let's talk some more about cognitive theories. So as we discussed before, the individual who has sensitivity to anxiety or high interoceptive awareness, so the person's negative automatic thoughts about higher arousal bodily sensations like sweating and heart rate, as well as a fear of panic attacks, can contribute to other maladaptive behaviors, namely avoidance of situations that elicit similar body sensations associated with panic attacks. Let's think about exercise and caffeine. If you exercise, your heart rate goes up, you feel short of breath. If you drink a lot of caffeine, your heart rate goes up and you could feel short of breath. That's how our body reacts to these situations. By not exposing ourselves to these situations where you have like a higher heart rate, or you feel like you're out of breath, you don't panic and therefore you feel safe. So what kind of reinforcement is this for panic? So anxiety results in avoidance, which leads to a temporary reduction of anxiety. That's negative reinforcement. So there's going to be a short-term gain here. So I don't go up the stairs, so I don't have to breathe heavily and feel anxious. But there's long-term pain because I keep the fear network intact, because I reinforce the idea that breathing heavily means that I am panicking and that I might die. So one prominent model of panic disorder is going to be called catastrophic misinterpretation. And this argues that because the individual can't learn that these sensations are harmless, these individuals will always interpret harmless body sensations, heart racing, as precursors to a physical catastrophe or heart attack, or even a psychological catastrophe. I'm losing my mind, I'm going insane. This in turn increases bodily symptoms. Your heart starts beating faster. Then the individual makes more negative interpretations of that experience, and this leads to panic. So right over here, we're going to take a look at catastrophic misinterpretation within panic disorder. First step is an individual misinterprets bodily sensations associated with anxiety, so a rapid heart rate. They interpret this as being dangerous. Now, the second step is the individual becomes more vigilant to the interoceptive cues of anxiety. So this is the hypervigilance, the anxiety sensitivity. This hypervigilance leads to an increased awareness of bodily reactions and bodily sensations. The person misinterprets these sensations as catastrophic events. So I'm sick, I'm going crazy, I'm going to die, and this leads to the panic attack. So just look right here. We have changes in bodily sensations, which leads a person to think that something bad is going to happen, which then feeds into the changes in bodily sensations. So something bad is going to happen. Now my heart is racing. Oh no, it's getting worse. My heart increases. Oh no, I knew it. Something bad's happening. Your heart goes higher and higher. Then you're like, oh no, I'm going to die. This is unmanageable. Now you have a panic attack. That's how catastrophic misinterpretation works. So there's some other factors that play a role in panic disorder. Let's look at stressful life events, like we talked about before with depression. Stressful life events can cause the onset of a panic disorder, and this stress tends to interact with a biological response. So biologically speaking, an excess of neurotransmitters such as norepinephrine, which is like adrenaline, can heighten a stress reaction. So in the absence of neurotransmitters such as serotonin, that decreases stress responses. And so situational anxiety can progress to a full-blown panic attack. So the fear module of the brain is composed of the amygdala, thalamus, the hypothalamus, and the visual cortex. But the amygdala forms a central part of this network. Now remember, what was the amygdala associated with? Emotion. So for those with a panic disorder, it might be that the fear module is triggered too often or at an inappropriate time. Now, catastrophic misinterpretations can't account for all panic attacks. So panic attacks that occur during sleep, usually aren't caused by catastrophic misinterpretation. However, one explanation for how these interpretations work involves classical conditioning, which promotes anxiety based on the physiological cues associated with the initial panic attack. So now let's move on to some epidemiology for panic disorders. Rates of panic disorder increase during adolescence, and they usually peak during adulthood. Females are more likely than males, there's a 2-to-1 ratio, to be diagnosed with a panic disorder. And there are lower rates of panic disorder among Latinx, African American, and Asian Americans when compared to Caucasians. Now, there might be a variety of reasons why this difference exists. It could be explained by a variety of factors. So that could be underreporting, misdiagnosis, a lack of access to resources, etc. All right, here's a review question here. So Sylvia easily notices when her heart rate increases suddenly and assumes that this means she is having a heart attack. As a result, her heart rate continues to increase. She starts sweating and she has trouble catching her breath. She continues to assume that these physical symptoms are indicative of the onset of a heart attack, which makes the physical symptoms increase in number and intensity and make her attributions worse. And this results in a panic attack. This is going to be interpretation of, is this A, negative reinforcement, B, catastrophic misinterpretation, C, preparedness model, D, the tripartite model, E, positive reinforcement. All right, go ahead and think about your answer. All right, lock it in. All right, the answer is B, catastrophic misinterpretation. Take a look at the process here. One thing is making the other thing worse, which strengthens the other thing. So A influences B, B influences A, and they get worse and worse and worse. So this is reciprocal causality. A influences B, B influences A, get worse and worse and worse and worse, reciprocal causality. All right, so let's talk about some treatments for anxiety disorders. One of the most common forms of treatment for anxiety disorders is going to be medication. So this form of treatment targets neurological factors through medications like antidepressants, benzodiazepines, and azapirones. Now, for these anxiety medications, there are going to be some side effects. So the side effects for benzodiazepines include sedation and also possible addiction. It's especially relevant. Try to screen those with a history of alcohol and substance abuse before prescribing benzodiazepines. Azapirones are often preferred over benzodiazepines since they don't cause drowsiness and they don't interact with the effects of alcohol, but they actually don't provide relief from anxiety as quickly as benzodiazepines. So one of the big problems with using medication is that it can be used as an avoidance mechanism because medication only treats the symptoms of anxiety in the moment. Medication does not necessarily help with the negative associations that are held in the long term. And remember, medications do have some risk of abuse and dependence. There's another form of treatment for anxiety disorders, and this is going to be cognitive therapy. Now, the goal of cognitive therapy is to make changes to inaccurate interpretations about the likelihood and meaning of events. So this is just like what we were talking about for cognitive restructuring in other disorders like depression and bipolar disorder, where the goal here is to restructure maladaptive thought patterns into more realistic ones. So for example, in panic disorder, the goal may be to deal with catastrophic interpretations about the body sensations and change the meaning for them. So for example, an individual might be like, when I have a panic attack, it feels like I'm going to die. That's the evidence for. Now what we want to do is help them restructure those thoughts by providing evidence against. So for example, the individual might think, well, I've had many panic attacks before and I've never died. And then they also might think, if any people have died from panic attacks. So this is an example of cognitive restructuring through cognitive therapy. Now we have exposure therapy. The goal of exposure therapy is to relearn associations between the feared object and outcomes goals and confront previously feared and avoided activities. So how do we do this? Well, we might think about this as being an example of classical conditioning, except for now we're actually focusing on the repairing of adaptive responses with the original feared stimuli. And we do this 3 ways: through imaginal exposure, which is the exposure of mental images of the fear-producing stimuli. We have in vivo exposure, which is direct exposure to a feared or avoided situation or stimulus. And then we have interoceptive exposure. So this is to intentionally try to elicit bodily sensations associated with panic in order to habituate the client to those sensations. So one way this might be done through some behavioral methods like relaxation, relearning how to breathe, things like that. Now, there is some evidence that in vivo or direct exposure to the stimulus is more effective than imaginal exposure. Actually, traveling up to the top of the Empire State Building in an elevator would be more effective than just looking at a picture of it and imagining yourself going to the top. Or even for like hematophobia, people with like a blood injury fear, actually witnessing the birth of a child may be more effective than watching a video of one or thinking about one. In general, a clinician will try to use in vivo exposure as the best treatment outcomes are associated with in vivo. However, many of the things clients fear, especially when the problem is not a specific phobia, are not possible for in vivo exposure, and therefore imaginal exposure must be used. For example, if someone has a fear of having a heart attack, one cannot intentionally induce a heart attack. Similarly, if one is afraid of being publicly humiliated, one would use imaginal exposure. So in such cases, the goal is not for the client to think that heart attacks or public humiliation are good or even neutral. It is try to help the client not to exaggerate how bad their sensations might be or a particular sensation might be. So right here, we're going to have a video on intensive exposure therapy. While you're watching this, think about the things we just talked about. What do you think about this kind of therapy? What do you think the outcomes might be?
1 week before she begins her treatment, I meet Siddhartha outside the clinic in downtown Boston. With her therapist nearby, we do a brief field test to assess her level of anxiety in situations that have been difficult for her in the past. For starters, I suggest we try to take a subway to a local mall. She says she'll try. When was the last time you were down in a subway like this?
Oh, about 2 years.
Do you feel like you could go through the stalls or not? You just tell me. I mean, I don't want to push you. You just tell me you don't want to do that. Why? What are you feeling?
Because then I feel like the pressure that once I get past the stalls, I've kind of paid for the token and I kind of can't go back. You know, again, it's like that first step that, you know, you're always trying to think of a way out.
Do you want to get out of here?
Yeah, I do. I would.
A week after we tried to take the subway together, Siddhartha returns to the Center for Anxiety Disorders to begin her therapy. The first 3 sessions focus on panic control treatment to help Siddhartha understand the nature of anxiety and how to deal with the fearful thoughts she often gets during a panic attack.
In some ways, it takes a leap of faith. The patient is so very fearful, and you're having them confront their worst fears.
In some respects, what you're really trying to do here is you're bringing her right to the brink of feeling panic. What if she has a meltdown? What if she has a panic attack right there?
Well, she will likely have a panic attack. But will that mean a meltdown? I don't think so.
Finally, a sort of panic attack chaser. Siddhartha is asked to drink an entire bottle of caffeinated water to actually heighten her anxiety so she can more fully experience the exposure therapy.
We're going to start today. Where do you think we're going to start?
In the elevator.
Yeah. How do you feel about that? What's your anxiety from 0 to 10?
Like 10.
For Siddhartha, like some other agoraphobics, elevators feel like vertical tombs. She hasn't used one in years.
Ready?
She'll take the stairs or nothing at all.
You can do it.
But not today.
Okay. It's okay. Just step in.
As it turns out, getting in is the easy part.
What's your worst fear?
That we'll get stabbed
And then what?
and we'll die in here.
Okay.
The therapist is steady and reassuring, but it's still 15 minutes before Siddhartha can even attempt to close the door.
I'm thinking, like, I don't even know if I can do this.
Why can't you? What's holding you back?
I'm afraid. I'm so scared.
It's your fear. This is hard.
Under therapist Sandra Baker's guidance, Siddhartha experiences a full-fledged panic attack.
And I have all these anxious thoughts about what will I do when the door closes.
For Siddhartha, simply being able to ride this elevator will become an act of terror and ultimately liberation.
I'm going to take my hand off of the button, and I want you to feel the anxiety. It will not hurt you. I'm taking my finger off. You're okay. You're okay. You're okay. That's just a behavior. That's anxiety. Feel it. You are fine. Look at how fine.
What are we doing? Oh my God.
Just let it come out.
Oh my God. Okay, I'm gonna let go of you, Sandra.
Finally, Siddhartha breaks through her worst fear.
You're doing it. This is great. You're doing it.
Oh my God.
Okay. Now don't go out of the elevator yet. I want
Okay.
you to just stay.
Eventually, like removing the training wheels, Siddhartha has to do it on her own.
Ready? Okay. You can do this. Oh, this is hard. She's going down.
Repeating the experience again and again breaks the back of her fear. And with each successive trip, Siddhartha's anxiety decreases.
Exactly.
Having taken her first leap of faith and found herself still mentally on solid ground, the next step was slightly easier. Back to the subway, again with therapist in tow. This time, although she was a bit nervous, she was able to take the train with the therapist. Then, once again, she had to do it on her own. Over the next 3 days, Siddhartha would not only ride the subway all over town, but also gain enough confidence to ride a bus by herself for the first time in years, to drive a car again, and to enjoy the simple pleasures of strolling the streets to do a little window shopping.
How are you doing?
Fabulous.
By the time I caught up with her at the Prudential Center in downtown Boston, Siddhartha seemed like a very different person from the young woman I'd met just a couple of weeks earlier.
I can just see the way you walk. It has a little more spring in your step.
Yeah.
Finally, to test the limits of her rediscovered freedom, I asked Siddhartha to join me for an elevator ride to the top of the Hub, a Boston landmark 53 stories up.
Are you ready?
Are you ready?
I am. I really, really am.
I think I'm more nervous than you are at this point.
You are.
Whether exposure therapy has a long-term benefit for people who have panic disorder with agoraphobia is still being researched. But for now, for Siddhartha, the sky's the limit.
So that video right there gave you an example of what exposure therapy is. So right over here, you see that we have some spiders. So this actually shows a little bit of a progression how exposure therapy might work. So right over here, you have an individual wearing a VR headset looking at a digital image of a spider. There's a puppet of a spider the therapist is holding when they touch that. An early phase of exposure therapy. Then the second spider right here, this is where like a therapist might put like a spider in front of their client, right? Like under a glass jar or maybe just on a table in front of them, or so the client can actually see the spider and be exposed to it. And this last one here would be one of the more advanced or final phases of exposure therapy, where the clinician would put a spider on themselves or even put a spider on the client. And this is a way for the clinician to try to help the client realize that the spider is normal, the fear that they had was unfounded, and try to help them work through the feelings that they are having. This is all based on the principle of pairing the feared stimuli in the absence of a feared outcome. So if you're scared of spiders, you might be afraid of being bitten by a spider, or a spider crawling in your ear, all the other kinds of different, getting in your mouth, all the other kinds of different fears you might have of a spider. So the way this works is you want the client to form new associations. So the object, the situation is going to take on a new meaning. And then you're going to have a new physiological response. So one of the ways you might do this is through situational exposure, systematic desensitization, kind of like the example I gave when I first put the slide on here about the spider. So the client is going to repeatedly confront the triggering stimuli, which in this case is a spider. The client is going to engage with the different kinds of phobic stimuli. So this could be like the spider, going outdoors, looking at a spider web. The client's going to be taught to relax, and while in a relaxed state, they're going to be presented with items on a fear hierarchy, starting with the least threatening. So a fear hierarchy is developed by a therapist and a client. They rank the most frightening or threatening stimuli related to their fear. So for example, if the client's afraid of heights, they might rank like looking at a picture of the Empire State Building as being not very terrifying, but maybe looking out from like the top of a tall building as being the most terrifying. Whereas maybe like being somewhere in the middle of the building would be okay. And systematic desensitization, the way this works is the client and the clinician are going to work their way up the fear hierarchy from easiest to most difficult. And then there's a form of systematic desensitization where you start at the top. So this is called flooding. So you present the client with their worst fear at first, and then work your way down the fear hierarchy. Fear hierarchy where you work your way up, which is systematic desensitization. There's fear hierarchy where you start at the top and work your way down, and that's flooding. So in each case, the client must learn to relax themselves in a fearful situation, and their fear gradually reduces. So look at the example here for the fear of spiders. Flooding is going to refer to the intense exposure or exposure to the most frightening element of the phobia within a short period of time. The way this works with spiders is I would take them into a room full of spiders, sit them on the couch, and let the spiders crawl over them. That's flooding. This is actually the most threatening and frightening type of therapy you could use. As a result, flooding is rarely used. Definitely not with dangerous animals like spiders, because those things can bite you and plant eggs under your skin. Another thing we want to talk about here is interoceptive exposure. This is another way you can desensitize somebody. So what you do is you work on confronting somatic responses in a controlled manner. So the client will engage with like their physiological responses like heart rate through controlled procedures like exercise. If my heart racing makes me scared or fearful of having a panic attack, I might start with some light exercise. And as my heart rate ramps up, I might ramp up the difficulty of the exercise. But the whole time, the clinician is saying that this is normal, your heart's beating, this is normal, this is okay, you're going to be okay. All right, so during exposure therapy, you are actually activating the entire fear network. You need to activate the entire fear network so new information can be added. Let's look at public speaking. So right here, this is an example of public speaking. The goal here is to develop a new associative network that removes the feared aspects so that the person can associate things like being relaxed and having a normal heart rate with public speaking. So basically, you want the individual to learn their ability to speak clearly and confidently and achieve their successes. So right here, I have a client who has a fear of public speaking. Their heart's racing. That's what they associate with public speaking. They have the sensation the heart is racing. Their palms are sweaty. Knees weak. Arms are heavy. Mom's spaghetti. Right here, you have public speaking associated with stuttering. So you can't speak clearly or confidently. Then also you're mumbling, so no one can understand what you're talking about. You're not enunciating. And then you have failure. Public speaking is associated with all these things, and the outcome is failure. So by activating the fear network, you want to retrain someone through exposure therapy that public speaking is no longer associated with heart racing. Now it's associated with a normal heart rate, where public speaking is now associated with speaking confidently, where public speaking is associated with success, with clear speaking, and with a relaxed sensation. So this is how you would retrain someone's fear network through exposure therapy. This is an example of a fear hierarchy. The clinician and the client would work together to come up with this hierarchy. Right here, you have a 0, no distress, to 100 panic attack. And what you want to do is the client is going to rank situations associated with their fear from a scale of 0 to 100. So let's say our example here is a fear of snakes. So starting at 40, the client and the therapist are going to work their way up. So you're going to say like, oh, look, seeing a movie with snakes in it. That'll be the first step. So that's not that bad. Then you might work your way up, seeing pictures of snakes, watching a documentary about snakes, seeing a snake on the street, being in a room with one snake in a cage, being in a room with multiple snakes on a cage. Then you might work up to like petting a snake in a cage, maybe having snakes loose in your house, maybe have one snake crawling on you, and then maybe have multiple snakes crawling on you. So there we go. So you're working your way up the fear hierarchy. Flooding works in reverse. You would start right on the top. You go into a room, I'm gonna throw a bunch of snakes on you and see what happens. I'm sick of these mother freaking snakes. in this motherfucking clinician's office. I'd say the other word, but I already put one F-bomb in this lecture. I'm probably gonna get fired for that one. So a client may come to a therapist with an intense fear associated with snakes, and this might manifest itself as persistent anxiety about snakes. So the goal in exposure therapy is going to be to induce a new association between snakes and feelings of safety and relaxation in order to disrupt the learned anxious response. So the ultimate goal is that the client, as a result of this exposure and associated relaxation, now feels calm in the presence of frightened stimuli related to snakes. We have snakes plus fear equals anxiety. And so the goal of the therapy is to replace the fear and anxiety with the safety and relaxation, so that way the client can feel calm. After therapy, the hope is that because of this paired response, the client now feels calmer regarding that particular fear. I see snakes, and now I just feel calmer, calm-ish. So here's another way this kind of therapy is used. So we have the panic attack model. The panic attack model suggests that a person interprets some sort of change in their body, sensations, like a normal change in heart rate, as an indication that something bad is happening, though that the interpretation that something bad is happening actually feeds back into the bodily sensations. So this is that reciprocal causality we were talking about a little bit earlier. So this is where now you might feel like even more queued up. You might have more heart rate racing and sensations like that. And so this, once again, feeds back into the idea that something bad is happening, which is that reciprocal causality we were talking about earlier, which is that catastrophic misinterpretation, which results in the panic attack. Here's the example right here. So with this treatment, what you're trying to do, trying to disrupt the belief that something bad is happening. Reinterpret that as, I'm okay. My heart is racing, but I'm okay. So now that you've done that, you've disrupted the cycle. Since you feel okay, your heart rate isn't increasing because you're not misinterpreting those sensations. And this disrupts that cycle. Minimize the chances of having a panic attack by disrupting that cycle. Let's go right here to some practice questions. All right, so here's some practice for us, some review. So when Sally began the 6th grade, she started having great difficulties interacting with other students. When in groups or talking to new people, she felt dizzy, hot, and sweaty, and worried about whether others would think she was ugly or stupid. This remained a problem for her throughout schooling. Now at age 25, she does not have any friends and has not been able to hold a job, and she spends most of her time alone in her apartment. What should she be diagnosed with? A, generalized anxiety disorder. B, specific phobia, C, social phobia, D, agoraphobia, or E, thermophobia. All right, go ahead and take a look right there. What's your answer? What do you choose? All right, that's right. The answer is C, social phobia. All right, so here's another one for you. Michael is a college at university. He expresses that every day he worries about his career, his health, the future death of his parents, and whether he is going to get into a car accident one day. He tries to distract himself from his worries, but he can't. He finds that he can't concentrate in class. He is fatigued and has lots of headaches. What should he be diagnosed with? A, generalized anxiety disorder. B, specific phobia. C, social phobia. D, agoraphobia. E, trypophobia. All right, got an answer? Let's take a look. All right, that's right. You got the answer. It is A, generalized anxiety disorder. All right, so here's our last one here. Sydney had repeated panic attacks in her 20s. Most of her panic attacks happened in public spaces, like on the bus, at work, on the subway, etc. Sydney's family has become concerned because she has not left her apartment in several months without great difficulty. Sydney expresses that she doesn't want to leave the house because she doesn't want to have a panic attack somewhere where she can't leave. Which of the following would she be diagnosed with? A, generalized anxiety disorder. B, specific phobia. C, social phobia. D, agoraphobia, or E, chronic anxiety disorder. All right, let's take a look right here. What's the answer? That's right, D, agoraphobia. All right, everybody. So if you have any questions about that or why the answers were the way they are, if some of those review questions didn't make sense to you, please come by office hours, send me an email. It's going to be very important for you to make sure that you're taking ownership of your education, that you are checking the calendar on Compass when assignments are due, that you are actually watching the lectures. I know there's those cheat groups going on for a group meeting and stuff like that, and people are passing around answers. The only person you're cheating is yourself. Like, spoiler alert. I don't know why you take clinical psychology. If you're not interested in clinical psychology, don't cheat. I've accessed the groups. I was able to log on to one of the groups. If you're in a group that's sharing answers, leave that group immediately. Only join a group that's helping each other study, not a group that's sharing answers and everything. So please, if you're in one of those groups, go ahead and leave it. Come to office hours, send an email, try. Now, if you're one of these people who just wants to get us an A, that's fine. I don't care. If I catch you cheating, we'll start a fair investigation through the university. I don't care. Whatever. Like, don't cheat. Just don't. All right. So the assignment number 1 is due this week. You should know when it's due because you're checking Compass, checking the syllabus. If you waited to the last minute to watch this lecture, guess what? Assignment is already due and you missed out. So you might as well log on the Compass and check out your 0. I'm giving 0s after it's due, like the next minute. I'm assigning 0s. So make sure you turn it in on time. All times are in Central Standard Time, so make sure you're turning it in on time. For those of you heard about quiz 1, you know that I have no problem getting 0s and I have no problem letting them stick. So you need to take ownership of your grade. So please double check it. All right. So that's the end of this rant. Talk to y'all later. Peace.